crafters, my name is Alex Vanover and I'm the content creator behind my brand DIY Alex. I'm going to teach you how to make your own Christmas wooden signs. First, I'm going to teach you how to prepare your wood, whether you want to stain it or paint it. Then we'll cut some vinyl on my Cricut Maker 3 and I'll show you how to place your vinyl on your wooden sign exactly where you want it so you get it perfect every single time. The tips that I'm going to be teaching you for placing your vinyl are going to save you so much time, headache, and probably a lot of vinyl too. I would have loved to know these tips when I first started making my own wooden signs because they would have saved me so much headache, and I hope that they help you too. Now, let's jump on in to this class. If you are using a blank from the craft store that's pre-finished, you probably don't need to sand your wood before beginning your wooden sign, unless you have a rough corner or something like that that you want to smooth out. If you have wood that's cut from a larger piece, then you'll definitely need to sand. My board is already pretty smooth, so I'm going to keep my sanding fairly fine. Sanding should be done with the roughest grit or the lowest number of sandpaper to the finest or the highest number grit of sandpaper. I'm going to sand all over the front of my sign with 220 grit sandpaper first. And then I'll sand all over the sign again with 320 grit sandpaper to finish. If your wood is really rough, then you may want to add another grit or two in between those two steps to smooth the wood out. You will also want to start with a rougher or lower grit sandpaper than I did to really make sure you get that wood smooth. The goal is to get the wood as smooth as you can for the vinyl, so however much sanding you need to do will depend on your blank. You'll see that I spent a fair amount of time on the short edges trying to smooth them out so that they will look better, also not give anyone a splinter, and they'll end up taking the stain a little bit better as well if they're smoother. If you have a sander, you may want to use that for this project, especially if you have a lot of sanding to do. Since my board isn't that big and it doesn't require a ton of sanding, I just decided to do mine by hand. I like to tear off a small piece of sandpaper and fold it in half. Be sure when you're sanding to sand in the direction of the wood grain. That's why I decided to sand side to side. Don't forget to sand the sides of your wood as well. Even if your vinyl isn't going to stick there, it's important to sand all the areas that will be showing in the front of the sign. Once you're finished sanding, wipe the blank down with a barely damp cloth to remove excess dust. Then let the wood dry to make sure there's no moisture in the wood before staining or painting. I like to prop up my sign on 4 medicine cups so that I know I'm not going to set my wood back down on a bunch of wood dust while it's drying. You'll see me use this tip in every single step to keep the wood up off the table. Once the wood is dry, then it's time to decide if you want to paint or stain your wood. If you decide to paint your wood sign, here's how to prepare your wood. Since my sign has a frame around it and I want to paint the background and my frame different colors, I'll begin by taping off the frame of my sign using painter's tape. This makes painting the frame a lot easier and it helps give me more crisp lines. Make sure you lay your painter's tape down straight against the edge of the sign so you don't accidentally paint too much of the background. Also be sure that the corners of your sign have plenty of tape since that's the trickiest part to paint. I am using chalk paint on my sign, but pretty much any type of paint will work fine for wooden signs. It just depends on the type of look that you want. Keep in mind that if you're using chalk paint like me, that usually requires more layers of paint, so that can make it more time consuming. I like to begin painting the hardest part first, and that's the inside of the frame. Once all the inside edges are covered, then I like to paint around the outside of the frame. After that, you'll see that I propped up my sign on the 4 medicine cups again to get better airflow underneath the sign for drying. Plus, it keeps the sign from sticking to the newspaper underneath. Then I painted the very top of the frame. Once you give your frame a few minutes to dry, then you can peel off the tape and begin painting the center of the sign. Since the inside edges of the sign are a bit rough, I didn't get perfect lines even after I taped my sign, but it's a lot better than it would have been if I was just freehand painting it. To paint the center with white chalk paint, I'm using a wider brush since I have more surface area to cover. I also like to start with the edges in the center because I like to get the hardest part over with. Once all the edges are coated, then I filled in the middle using my white chalk paint. Keep in mind that some wood is going to soak in the paint more than others, and that determines how much paint you'll end up using. Once the paint is dry, you can add more coats as desired. With white chalk paint, I always do at least 2 coats to get solid white coverage. But I usually end up doing 2 coats for projects like this, regardless of what color of paint I decide to use. I also touched up the edges of the frame when I added multiple coats, and if you're OCD like me and you like clean lines, then I recommend you do the same. If your sign is going to be exposed to moisture of any kind, then you'll need to seal your paint and wood. So for example, if you decide to keep your paint outdoors, or even if you keep it in a room of your home, like the bathroom or the kitchen, then sealing is definitely a good idea. I recommend using water-based polyacrylic when sealing your wood, especially when you're working with white chalk paint, so that the sealer doesn't yellow the paint over time. Then once the sealer is dry, you're ready to add vinyl to your painted wood sign. If you're staining your wooden sign, ensure that you're in a well-ventilated area for staining and sealing. I like to do all my staining in the garage with the garage door open. I use the medicine cup trick for staining as well to keep the edges easy to access. I always wear gloves while staining, and I like to remove my jewelry and my watch so that they don't get discolored. I am using Minwax stain in the color English Chestnut, which is usually my go-to color for stained wood signs. Shake up your stain well and then open it using a flathead screwdriver. Then fold your staining rag and dip it into the stain, and be sure to wipe the excess off on the side of the can to avoid drips. Then wipe the stain onto your sign in the direction of the wood grain. Don't forget to stain the edges to match the front of the sign, and be careful to avoid drips onto the front of the sign while you're applying the stain on the edges. It's handy to have a second rag in case you need to wipe any drips or excess stain away. On the shorter, rougher edges, I ended up having to dab the rag into the wood with more stain to make sure that the stain covered the entire area. But the smoother you've gotten your wood during sanding, the easier it will be to apply the stain. Once you're satisfied with the coverage, set the sign on top of medicine cups to dry. Once the first layer of stain is dry, you can layer multiple colors of stain if you prefer a darker finish. I like to let my stain sit at least overnight to ensure that it's completely dry, but depending on the temperature and humidity, depends on how long the dry time for your stain will be. To seal stained wood, I recommend sealing it with at least 1 layer of polyurethane to get the pores of the wood sealed and smooth for the vinyl that you're going to apply. I prefer the clear satin finish because it's not quite as glossy, and that's the look that I like. I always wear gloves while I work with polyurethane because it's super sticky, so definitely take my advice with wearing gloves. Make sure you're in a well-ventilated area while you work with polyurethane and while it is drying. Trust me, it will stink up the entire room if you're not well ventilated enough. I have found it easiest to work with a foam brush so that I don't have to worry about leaving any bristles behind. Dip the foam brush into the polyurethane and then wipe on the side of the can so that you don't have a ton of excess product on your brush to help avoid drips. Begin wiping the polyurethane on the wood, and remember, the little bit goes a long way. You do not want a super thick coat for polyurethane. Once the front is covered, then seal the sides as well. On the short sides, I had to dab more polyurethane on than I usually would, just like I did for the stain. Set the wood back on the medicine cups to dry. You do not want to go over the polyurethane a ton with your brush, but do make sure that none of the polyurethane pooled on the front when you were sealing the sides. You can use your brush to smooth that out. Make sure you let your polyurethane dry until it's no longer sticky. For crafting purposes, I'm only going to do 1 coat of polyurethane to make sure the surface is smooth enough for vinyl. If your coat of polyurethane ends up being rough once it's fully dry, or you just want to do some fancy woodworking on your signs, then you can sand your polyurethane layer with some very fine steel wool. I have found that the 4/0 is best to work with. That's what the grade 0000 means, 4/0. Then once you're done sanding with the steel wool, wipe off the dust and do a second and maybe even a 3rd layer of polyurethane as needed. Polyurethane layers take a long time to dry, around 24 hours. So you may have to wait an entire day to do each layer of polyurethane. So keep that in mind when planning your projects. This staining your signs requires a lot more work and dry time than painting them. Once your wood is dry and prepped, then it's time to add vinyl to your sign.
So the first step to getting your wooden signs set up in Design Space is of course to begin with the designs you want to use. So I'm going to go into my Uploads tab of Design Space and grab some of my recently uploaded SVG files and then click the green Add to Canvas button. Then once these files are in Design Space, now I can work with them individually to get them ready for each of my signs. So I'm going to begin by zooming out here so we can see the entire design at once and separating these designs. So we'll begin with this one here at the top. The background of this one is white, so you can probably guess that this is for my painted wooden sign. But I created these SVG files for you, and I wanted to explain why there are little trees at the bottom of the design. For now, everything is grouped. While I have it selected, I need to go over to the Layers panel and choose Ungroup so that we can work with everything individually. So you'll see on this sign that it has two little trees beside Mary, and these two little trees at the bottom are just to give you some different options depending on the type of style that you like for your sign. This little green tree is the same as these two trees, it's just a little bit larger. And then this tree has a tree top as well as a stump. So if you prefer like a two-part tree where you want like a little bit of a trunk, then you can replace the two trees here with this tree right here. But I like the way that this looks, so I'm going to go ahead and draw a box around both of them and delete them. Now we just have the elements of the sign left over. And the first step would be to size the white background or the template for the size of your sign blank. So this one is already sized to the design that I'm doing. It's 18.5 inches wide by 8.5 inches high. But if you need to change that for the dimensions of your sign, you can go ahead and select it, and then you can click the unlock button here at the top, and then you can type in the dimensions of your sign blank here. Then once you have your template sized, next you can size your design to fit your template. So I'm going to go ahead and select all my pieces, and I'm going to make them slightly smaller than I have them on the template right now. And that's because my sign blank has a frame around it, and that can make applying the vinyl a little bit tricky to the background. So I want to have a little bit more space left over so that it's a little bit easier to apply my design. So in order to select all these elements, I'm going to go over to the Layers panel and begin by clicking them and then holding down my Shift key while I click each of the trees as well as the Mary. And that way everything is selected so that we can size it together. Then I'm going to go over to one of the corners and wait until my mouse turns into this double-ended arrow. And then I'll hold my mouse down and just move it in a little bit because I still want it to take up the majority of the sign, but I also want to make sure that, like I said, it's easy to apply. So I like the way that that looks. It's just giving a couple inches of border all the way around the outside, and I think that's going to be perfect. So now that I have my file sized correctly, next I'm going to go ahead and hide my template because I already have my blank in front of me, so I don't need to cut out the template. The purpose of the template is just to size your design correctly so you don't waste material getting the size correct. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it, and then over in the Layers panel, I'm going to click the eyeball just to hide it so that if I ever decide to come back and change it, I can do so. Oh, and I have one more change that I want to make. I decided I wanted to make my trees a little bit more festive. So I'm going to move my Christmas out of the way, and I'm going to click on both of my little trees by clicking on one, holding Shift, and then clicking on the other one. I'm also going to attach them so that they cut in this exact order so that they are perfectly spaced. Then I do want to change the color because I'm going to be using a really pretty glitter vinyl. I'm going to make them like a yellow color so that I remember to cut them out of that gold color. And I might alter these colors a little bit. I'm going to do a slightly brighter green than the green I have on this file, maybe like this one. And that pretty much finishes that up. So now I can scroll down and customize the bottom sign template and everything for my sign. So again, we'll begin by sizing the template background, which mine is already sized to my sign, which is 18 inches wide by 9.25 inches high. Don't forget to click the unlock button and type in your dimensions if your sign dimensions are different from mine. Then while I have everything selected, I'm going to come over here and click ungroup so that I can work with each of these pieces individually. Now, this sign is the stained piece and it does not have any kind of a frame. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the sizing the same as I have it right now because I can go all the way to the edges with my vinyl, and I love to take up as much room as I can so that I can see my really, really pretty vinyl. And I believe I'm going to leave these colors the way that they are right now. I'm going to be cutting the snowflake out of a really pretty like holographic blue. And then I'm going to do some brighter colors on this sign to make sure that they pop really well against the dark background. So since everything looks good and it's the way that I want it to be, I still need to go ahead and hide this template. And then once I do, I'm ready to start cutting. But before I proceed through my project, I do want to save my project so that in case I have to come back and make any changes, this makes it really easy. Then once everything is saved, I can click on the green Make It button. Then because I am working on the Cricut Maker 3, my machine is going to ask what way I'm going to be cutting my materials. And I am not using any smart vinyl today, so I'm going to choose on a mat for everything. And I believe I'm going to need to do probably some 12 by 24 inch mats. Now we do have to use the correct mat size that we select here because the third generation machines like the Cricut Maker 3 and the Explorer 3 do measure your mat before you proceed. So whatever you tell it right here, you do have to use. But I believe some of my designs are bigger than 12 inches by 12 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and choose 12 inches by 24 inches for the mat size and then click the green continue button. Then once I do that, I will double check all of my mats and make sure that everything is the way that I want it to be. So as you can see on this sign here, I'm still going to have to use the 12 by 24 inch mat because I already selected that, but I don't have to make my vinyl 12 inches by 24 inches. I'll just put enough vinyl on this mat to cut out these little trees. Then we'll double check that Christmas is on its own mat, so that looks good. The snow portion is on its own mat, and I am going to be cutting these different shades of the color green, so I do want them to be on their own mat. The snowflake is by itself, and the Let It and the Mary are the same color, which is fine. I'm just going to take the Mary and scoot it over a little bit so that there's a little bit more space in between these two. But otherwise, that looks great. I don't need to mirror anything since I'm not using any heat transfer vinyl. So then I'll click the green continue button to proceed through my project. And once my Cricut Maker 3 connects, then I'll be able to choose my cut setting. Now I'm using permanent adhesive vinyl on all of these mats, except for the blue mat and the yellow mat. I'm going to be using like a holographic type of vinyl. So for the blue and yellow mat, I'm going to be using the glitter vinyl with more pressure on the drop down menu for my cut setting. And then these other mats, I'm going to be using the premium vinyl permanent glossy setting just because I think that gives me a really, really good cut with most permanent vinyl. So now let's hop over to my craft table so that we can assemble all of our vinyl pieces and finish up our signs.
So the next step is to cut your vinyl down to the size that you need it on the mat and place it on the mat according to the size that you have set in Cricut Design Space. Then load the mat into your machine and allow your Cricut to cut. Remember to change the cut setting in between the different types of vinyl if you're using multiple types of vinyl in your sign like I am. Be sure to flip your mat over to remove your vinyl off of the mat and continue cutting each of the other colors in your project. Next, you'll just use your weeding tool of choice to remove all the excess vinyl from the backing or weed it, and then add each piece to its own piece of transfer tape. When it's time to add your vinyl to transfer tape, I recommend using the lowest tack transfer tape you can find so that you don't risk pulling up any of the polyurethane or the paint on your wooden signs. Now, since my transfer tape doesn't have a backing, I'm gonna pull out a long roll and then add each of my pieces of vinyl face down to try and save a little bit of transfer tape, and then I'll cut them apart so that I can individually place them on the sign. So I'm gonna place my transfer tape with the sticky side up, and then place each of these long pieces on it first. And then I'll kind of roll it down the transfer tape like this. And then I can place some of these smaller pieces underneath it and save from wasting a ton of transfer tape. I can save this piece of transfer tape for a future project. And now I'll cut these pieces apart. Now it looks like some of these are overlapping, but the vinyl actually isn't. So I'll go ahead and peel back the paper backing and cut the pieces of transfer tape apart. Then with each one, I'll burnish well with my squeegee or apply enough pressure so that the transfer tape and the vinyl will stick together. Then I'll follow the same process of applying pressure with my squeegee. Once the vinyl has been finished, it has transfer tape and it's all burnished, now it's time to apply our vinyl decals to our signs. Just be sure to leave the backing on the vinyl so that we can place it using some of my favorite methods. Once your vinyl is ready to place on your signs, you're gonna need a couple of tools to place the vinyl exactly where you want it to go. You'll need a pair of scissors and a squeegee to actually apply the vinyl, and I'm gonna show you two different methods to place your vinyl exactly where you want it. One is the hinge method, where all you'll need is a roll of painter's tape, and the other is the parchment paper method. So I'm just gonna be using regular parchment paper. If you are from the UK or another country besides the US, you may call this baking paper. But I have this piece right here that I like to use over and over again, and I'm gonna use both of these to help place my vinyl depending on the size and things like that. So let's begin first with our stained sign, since that's gonna be a little easier to place the vinyl without any sort of frame. The first thing I'm gonna do to get started is to place my vinyl where I want it tentatively on the sign. So the first layer that I'm gonna worry about is the largest layer. And notice that I still have the backing on the vinyl. You do not want to remove that just yet until right before you're about to place it. Then I'm gonna place the snowflake where I think it's gonna go right here. And then I also wanna measure where the let it is going to be to make sure that it has plenty of space up at the top. And I think that's gonna be just about perfect. So I'm gonna remove these two smaller pieces and I'm gonna keep this larger layer in place. And since this layer is actually bigger than my piece of parchment paper, I'm gonna secure this layer using the hinge method. So the way that the hinge method works is you're gonna place your vinyl exactly where you want it to go with that backing still on the vinyl itself. And then you're gonna take a piece of painter's tape and get it large enough so that it can go across the middle of the design. Now it doesn't have to be exactly in the middle, it just needs to be in the middle-ish to anchor it down. So I'm gonna place it right here. And the important part is that it's gonna keep it in place on the sides of the blank. So the painter's tape needs to be wider than the decal itself. And what this does is it keeps it in place to ensure we stick the vinyl exactly where we want it to go and it doesn't shift at the last minute. We'll go ahead and peel away the backing like this. And once I have the vinyl and transfer tape pulled back, I'm gonna use a pair of scissors and cut away the backing so that I can actually place the vinyl and transfer tape onto the sign. Then as I slowly lower the vinyl and transfer tape down onto the wood, I'm going to use my squeegee tool to help me lower it down so that I don't get any bubbles or anything in my vinyl or transfer tape. Then I'm going to burnish it well onto the surface. And once we have one side down, this is what's considered our hinge. So then we can remove our painter's tape and we can do the same thing on the other side of our sign, but we already know that our vinyl is going to be placed exactly where we want it. And that's the beauty of the hinge method, is that we don't have to be stressed at all about the placement because we know it's going to go down exactly where we want it to. And again, I'll just use my squeegee tool. And that is the beauty of sealing the surface of your wood. If I left this wood raw, which you guys will kind of see when we do the painted sign, it'll be a little bit trickier to remove the transfer tape and to get the vinyl to stick because the surface won't be quite as smooth. But whenever you seal your wood so that it has a nice smooth surface to stick to, it likes to stick there and makes everything super easy. But now that we're down to these smaller pieces of vinyl, I'm going to use the parchment paper method instead of the hinge method for these last couple of pieces. So I'm going to begin for the parchment paper method by removing the backing of my vinyl on this piece. And once we have it removed, we're going to stick the parchment paper to the back of our design, but I am going to leave a little bit of the vinyl as well as a small stripe of transfer tape exposed at the top. So when I am ready to stick this down, it will stay where I want it to stay. And actually that's the side of my snowflake, but as long as you have somewhere to anchor it, that doesn't really matter. Now, the magic of the parchment paper method is allowing my vinyl to be repositionable. It's a little tough to see on the camera, but the parchment paper is clear enough that I can still see the vinyl through it. So I can place my snowflake exactly where I want it to, and I can still see the rest of the vinyl through my design. So I don't have to stress about my placement or commit before I'm ready to place it down. And then when I think I have it in the right spot, what I'll do is I'll push down that stripe of transfer tape that I left exposed. Then I'll pull up my snowflake and remove the parchment paper. And then I can lower down my vinyl and transfer tape just like I did with the hinge method using my squeegee. And then I have a perfectly placed piece of vinyl. Once I've burnished it well, I can remove that transfer tape. And another layer of our sign is done. Then I'll use the parchment paper method again with the last layer of vinyl for this sign. And once we have it stuck down, then we're ready to reposition our vinyl. And I want to make sure that it's close to this, but it doesn't kind of blend in with the word. I also want to make sure there's plenty of space at the top of the sign as well. Looks just about perfect. So then I'm going to push down that top stripe of transfer tape, remove the parchment paper, and then squeegee it down nice and slow. Then after it's burnished, we'll remove that transfer tape. And our first sign is all good to go. So now let's go ahead and repeat the same methods that we used to apply this vinyl to our painted sign. So one of the tips of always getting the hinge method correct is to trim away as much transfer tape around the background as you can to make sure that you can see your sign. So since there's a little bit of extra backing and transfer tape down at the bottom of Christmas, I am going to go ahead and cut most of that off so that I can make sure that I space it correctly from the bottom of my sign. Then this way I can move it around and see where I want it. And for now, I'm gonna place it about there. I think it looks even on these sides of the frame. There's a little bit of space at the bottom, but let's make sure that the Mary and the trees can fit in there as well. So there's a bit more space at the top. So I think I'm gonna move Christmas up just a little bit, and I can place my trees about there and place Mary in the middle. So again, I'm gonna use the hinge method with the larger piece of vinyl here with my painter's tape. So now we'll lift up one half of our sign, and it doesn't matter which side you decide to do first. Then I'll cut off the backing on this one side. Use my squeegee to lower down the vinyl without any bubbles or issues. Then we can remove our painter's tape and repeat the process on the other side. And Christmas is placed perfectly. Now, let me give you a little bit of a pro tip if you have unsealed wood like I do. So because I'm keeping this sign indoors and it's not going to be exposed to any moisture, I chose not to seal it with polyacrylic on the white section. So sometimes vinyl has trouble sticking to non-sealed wood because it's such a porous surface. So one thing you can do to make this easier is to use a bouncy ball, kind of like this, or a tennis ball. And you can actually roll it over top of your wood to really help work the vinyl into those pores. This is especially helpful with raw wood, and even though our wood is painted so it's not totally raw, it's still rough enough that the vinyl may have some issues sticking. So trust me, this trick is going to be so helpful. And most likely you probably already have something lying around your house that can help you with it. So once we have gone over it with our rubber ball, then we can peel away our transfer tape super easily. And this is also helpful if you use a less tacky transfer tape like we talked about. Sometimes those tackier transfer tapes do make adding vinyl to wood a little bit more difficult. So now that we have these other pieces, let's go ahead and place them on the sign where we think they are going to go. With the parchment paper method, we are only going to do one layer at a time, and I'm going to place the trees first because that kind of depends on where Mary is going to sit as well. So I'll go ahead and peel these trees off their backing and add the parchment paper to the backing with a little bit of either the top or the side exposed. Then we can place our trees with a perfect view of the rest of the sign. Maybe like that. We can even try the Mary on to see how it's going to look. That's the beauty of using tools like this. So I'm going to go ahead and smooth down that top stripe of transfer tape. Remove the parchment paper and then just ease those little trees onto the wood. I'm going to use my bouncy ball again to really work that in. And now we'll work on our final layer. And another great thing about the parchment paper is that the parchment paper can be used over and over again. I have several pieces that I use actually all the time. I just have different sizes already cut depending on the size of my vinyl. Then once Mary looks centered in between my trees, I'm just going to push down that top stripe, remove the parchment paper, and smooth it into place. Then we'll work it into the wood using our ball and remove the transfer tape. And now the front side of both of our signs are finished. So now that these are finished on the front, now we just need to add some hangers on the back so that we can display them in our Christmas home decor. So the final step to preparing your Christmas wooden sign is to add some hangers to the back. So I'm going to be adding some of these small sawtooth hangers that look like this, but I'm sure you guys know there are tons of options. You could glue a ribbon to the back. You could, hang it using one ribbon, two ribbons, sawtooth hangers, picture wire, so many different options. I just think these sawtooth hangers are a little bit easier, so that's what I'm going to be using today. The other thing that you need to check when you are hanging these is to make sure that the tacks are not going to go through the front of your sign. So I'm going to be hanging mine from the back, and I want to double check that my tack is not going to go all the way to that front edge so that you can't see it through the front of the sign. I've already checked this on both of my signs and it looks good to me. Just make sure you do so before you start hammering these in place. So I'm gonna flip the sign over with the back side facing up at me. And I like to begin by setting how far apart I'm gonna put my picture hangers. I'm gonna put a ruler across the back. I happen to have an 18-inch ruler, and this is basically a perfectly 18-inch wide sign. And I'm gonna make a mark at like the 5 and the 13-inch mark so that I know exactly how much to measure over when I go to hang these. And you want to make sure they're distributed wide enough so that it helps the sign hang straight. If they're too close to the center, that's not going to help it be straight. So I'm going to make a mark like right here and right here at the 13-inch mark. How far apart you put them is not as important as having them be the same length down from the top of the sign, because that's going to ensure that the hangers are straight so that the sign hangs straight on the wall. So I'm going to go to each of my marks and I'm just going to pick an arbitrary number down from the top. So I will probably choose to hang my hangers about 1 inch from the top exactly. So I'm gonna make sure that my ruler is square to the top of the sign, and I'm gonna make a mark right here. And this is gonna represent where I'm gonna put the inside nail for my picture hanger. So it just needs to be about in that cross right there is where I wanna hang the right-hand side of my hanger. So while I'm here, I can actually probably go ahead and mark that using my pencil. And then I'm gonna extend that line out some so that I have another line for my second nail to hang off of. So I'll draw another line like that. And now I know exactly where I want the other nail to be hammered in. So then I have pencil marks for each of these. So then I'm gonna come to my other mark and I'm gonna mark this 1 inch down as well. So again, I'm gonna make sure that my ruler is square with the top of my sign. And then I'm gonna mark a straight line across from that 1 inch. And that's gonna represent the inside nail on this picture hanger. And then I'll extend that line out to my other nail. And then I can double check using my ruler that they are exactly even, and they look really even to me. So now I'm just gonna hammer each of the picture hangers into place using the marks that I made. We'll get this side started. Then once you get it started, finish hammering it in place. Then we just repeat the process for the other side. And when you're finished, you're ready to hang your wood Christmas decor on the wall. So now that you've seen the process for staining and painting wooden signs, I would love to hear from you which one you're the most excited to try. So be sure to tag me in the Cricut Craft Fest Facebook group and let me know whether you're excited to stain or paint your wooden signs. If you want to see more Cricut craft tutorials, tips, and resources from me, then I would love to connect with you over on social media at DIY Alex Vanover. Happy holiday crafting!